welcome everybody. I am very pleased to present Professor Jürgen Ruland today. Jürgen has been in Hong Kong before, but we wanted to, make sure he understood the space limitations that we face here in Hong Kong. So we chose not a huge lecture hall, but this. And,
this is one of our bigger rooms.
So he does get a real Hong Kong experience here. Thanks everybody for coming. And Jürgen is a very old friend, young at heart, but a very old friend. Jürgen is prominent in the field of international relations. Southeast Asia studies, but I should also add, having taught in the German system for several years, a very important figure in the German scene, and I was one of his informal mentees over the years. Much appreciated the support he gave to young and struggling scholars in those days. He continues to have a large number of PhD students, so a number of important Southeast Asianists have studied with Jürgen, who is a professor of political science at the Department of Political Science at the University of Freiburg, Germany. Which I should add does very well in rankings. German universities aren't known to be ranking conscious, but when you do look at the rankings, Freiburg is an excellent university and has one of the leading, if not the leading, Southeast Asia programs in that country, and that program has produced a number of important scholars who are now teaching in various places around the world. Jürgen's research interests include interregionalism, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, democratization of international organizations, global governance and international relations, in the Asia-Pacific, or shall I say Indo-Pacific, or Indo-Asia, what's it called now? What was it called? Indo-Pacific region. He's the author of the recently published Indonesian Way, which is what he'll be talking about today, and the ASEAN as an actor in international fora, which is, the first book is a Stanford book, the second a Cambridge University Press book. So we're very pleased to have Jürgen here. Before, however, I conclude my introduction, allow me to advertise our next seminars. After Easter, we have a seminar with Dr. Angeline de Dios, who's at Lingnan University. She'll be talking about Filipino singers, reflections on authenticity and musical labor. Of course, very relevant theme here in Hong Kong. So that's on 9 April, I think also at 4 p.m.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll be in a very large room, just like this one. But Jürgen, again, thanks very much for coming. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for these kind words, which have, of course, the disadvantage of heightening the pressure, the performance pressure. I hope I could meet the expectations that have been raised. Now, as Mark has mentioned already, the presentation today is strongly animated by a book that I have recently published. That's it. And this book project has been supported by a research project at that time entitled Constructing Regionalism Domestically, Local Actors and Foreign Policy Making in Newly Democratized Indonesia. And that research project was supported by a research grant of the National University of Singapore and the University of Stanford Lee Kong Chan Distinguished Scholarship for Southeast Asia. And I happened to be the successor of Mark in that program, but that was a very great and strong inspiration for my work. And later on, I also enjoyed two research grants from the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Study, which enabled me to write the book, and to all institutions, of course, go my gratitude and my thanks. Now that's what I have prepared for today. After a short introduction, I would try to outline the theoretical premises of this book and the methodology, and then in a next step develop a benchmark according to which the changes in conceptualizations of regionalism can be measured in Indonesia, and then in the fourth step I would report try to summarize some of my major findings in a nutshell before I would then go on to the contemporary period, what has changed from the Yudhoyono era to the Jokowi era, and then end with a few conclusions. Now, coming to the objectives of the study, the contextualization of the study, it's mainly thought as a contribution to studies on ideational and normative diffusion. It's here in particular a critique of research that proceeds very much from what has become known as the world polity theory. I will briefly mention that later on. And it highlights the key question, to what extent due to normative diffusion and ideal diffusion we can observe increasingly similarity of institutions, or whether there is still difference that characterizes institutions across the world. Is there convergence or divergence? That's the key question. And I also happened to work on the analytical framework for research on processes of norm diffusion, and in effect also I think it is a contribution to what could be called a global international relations theory, building against the background of what has been frequently criticized as a strong Western or Westernized theorizing in this fields, like in so many fields in social science. Now, very general, the research questions are: can ideas, can norms, can policies travel, and what happens if ideas travel? How do they change when they meet new actors? And here it is especially about regionalism that the research is about. And here, of course, the European Union has acquired a reputation of being a model for regional integration, and some people have called the EU a normative power, and a research project that has been conducted by colleagues Tanja Börzel and Thomas Risse spoke even of a transformative power. That's quite far reaching in the implications. And here again the question is, do regional organizations that imitate the European Union become more similar to the European Union? Is there a global trend that regional organizations become more similar? Is there a global script, as an American colleague called it in a paper? Now, the background of this issue, similarity versus difference, is that I see a lot of problems with the so-called world polity model, which is a analytical model first developed by the Stanford School of Sociology, which based on Weberian thoughts and modernization theory posited that the process of bureaucratic rationalization in the West is also taking root in non-Western societies through the process of globalization. So that's basically quite one-sided view of things, where modernization radiates out from Western centers to non-Western regions. And therefore it is argued that institutions elsewhere in the world appropriate Western institutional development, and therefore there is this argument that institutions are increasingly becoming similar, and then there is a convergence of non-Western institutions towards those frontrunners in the West. Although there was some backpedaling by those who argued along the similarity argument, nevertheless, I think basically the argument is maintained. And I question this argument of increasing similarities, and my focus is more on difference. Because I think that the world polity model overemphasizes structural similarities and underestimates cultural differences, and it overrates macro processes and underrates micro processes. And instead of the world polity model, my basic point of departure is the multiple modernities literature, which I believe is more context sensitive, and that model questions this trend towards increasing homogenization and convergence of social phenomena as a result of globalization and bureaucratic rationalization. And it also questions that there is only one modernity. This is a myth, and it argues that institutions are socially and culturally embedded, and therefore also when we come to regionalism that we discuss here, this leads to varieties of regionalism, as one colleague, Francesco Duena, called it, and Southeast Asian regionalism is one of these varieties. And this leads me to the more specific research question, to what extent and how and under what circumstances have processes of ideational diffusion taken place in Indonesia, in Indonesian visions of regionalism, and to what extent the appropriation of European ideas on regionalism makes Indonesian thinking on regionalism more similar to the EU, and especially how Indonesian foreign policy stakeholders respond to that process of so-called Europeanization, and using the words of a former Indonesian vice president and foreign minister, Adam Malik, is there an Indonesian way to regionalism and foreign policy making? Now, the discourse on regionalism under the aegis of democratization provides quite favorable conditions for the influx of European ideas of regionalism to enter the Indonesian debate, and so forth. It's a quite sensible undertaking to study in how far these European influences have affected Indonesian thinking. Now, the value added of this study is basically that the so-called Europeanization research, which originated among European specialists, which studied in how far the acquis communautaire of the European Union travels to the accession countries in Eastern Europe. That was the original topic of that research, and then was later extended to the study in how far the European Union also influences through its various support programs other regional organizations in the world. This research, in my opinion, only affected so-called epiphenomena of diffusion, because it only looked at the terminology and the organizational structure of organizations, but did not really go into the black box of what is contained in regional organization, the spirit of institutions, the underlying norms that shape the institutions. That is neglected, and by introducing a so-called ideational longue durée, I seek to explore the resilience of extant political ideas, even though it seems that this influence of European institutionalist ideas on regionalism are quite strong. What is also new in my analysis is a disaggregation of the stakeholder perceptions. Very frequently, these kind of studies only look into what governments, what the bureaucracy thinks about foreign policy making. But here in this case, I will come back to that in a minute. I will also look into a lot of into a broad range of societal stakeholders, non-state stakeholders in this debate on Southeast Asian regionalism and Indonesian foreign policy. Then also one of the blind spots of this Europeanization research is also that it does not take into account the backsliding of organizational and normative changes. Very frequently there is a linear perspective on ideational change, and as I will show, this is not the case in Indonesia, and I also already mentioned that I would like to pursue a more immanent perspective of what Indonesians think about ideational change. Now coming very briefly to the theory and the methodology, as you might see here, I am strongly influenced by the work of Amitav Ajaya, who has greatly inspired research on norm diffusion, and what I try to develop is an analytical framework that builds on a 4-point matrix of responses to normative challenges, which range from two extreme reactions, complete rejection or complete transformation. Both in reality occurs very rarely. What usually occurs is some sort of emulation of ideational challenges or ideational models, what I call mimicry, or what in the literature is called mimicry, and another response would be localization. Localization is a stronger response because it fuses old and new ideas, norms, policies, whereas mimicry is only a change of the formal structure. There are names and terminologies that are adopted, but not the norms as such, and not the causal beliefs that are implied in these norms. And localization also is a stronger challenge because it comes from outside, externally as well as from inside the society, and it needs a public discourse with an open contestation, so that this fusion of old and new ideas can happen, whereas mimicry usually happens without public discourse, or at best a hegemonic discourse, and there's no major change in the identity and a very limited degree of political learning involved in that. In a democratizing country like Indonesia, the expectation would be that localization is much more likely than mimicry, and this is also what I found out later on. And localization, as I said, is a process of making new externally propagated norms compatible with a so-called cognitive prior existing extant ideas through what Acharya has defined as framing, grafting, and pruning. By framing, he means a communicative strategy that gives meaning to events and observed phenomena. Grafting denotes the construction of a nexus between old and new ideas, and pruning is a process of cutting, selecting those elements of the new norm and also of the old norm which do not fit this fusion and which are left behind as a result. Briefly, a word on the methodology. I selected a case where I could particularly well study these processes, and the occasion to study that was the ASEAN Charter debate in Indonesia that took place in the years between 2005 and 2009. The ASEAN Charter, as probably all of you know, is some sort of a constitutional document undergirding the basic ideas of regional cooperation in Southeast Asia, and as this process of the ASEAN Charter also involved a lot of normative reforms, it was a very apt occasion for studying norm diffusion on regionalism in Indonesia. Now, I understood ASEAN as a regional governance system, and governance systems usually are characterized by three major functions, or three major dimensions: political order functions, welfare functions, and security functions. And I expected in a deductive way of analytical procedure that these three functions could also be found again in the debate on the ASEAN Charter. But I did not only proceed in a deductive way. Later on, I also did an inductive study of the material I had, with some consequences on which I still will talk. And here are the disaggregated stakeholder groups apart from the government. It is NGO representatives, which are very vocal in this debate, legislators, academics, the media, especially the print media, and the business sector. Now, the research techniques, it's basically built on a discourse analysis in these 4 years of press reports of interviews, public interviews with stakeholders. And as I said, it's deductive, but later on also an inductive run of about 240 selected newspaper articles have been made, plus of course the other techniques that usually are part and parcel of field work, like expert interviews, literature review, grey literature, new media, participant observation, and so on. Now, coming to the next step, the benchmark, the cognitive prior. The cognitive prior, as Acharya has defined it, is an existing set of ideas, belief systems, and norms which determine and condition an individual or social group's receptivity to new norms. In other words, it's the extant set of beliefs and norms. Now, of course, you could blame me that this is a quite essentialist approach to look at things, but I would refute that and say, no, it is basically a stock taking of what are the dominant ideas in Indonesian thinking on ASEAN and Indonesian foreign policy, and I think that there is such an orthodoxy that can be defined with relatively great ease, and that is when you look at ASEAN, the orthodoxy of the ASEAN Way, which has also been upheld in Indonesia for most of the time until to the debate on the ASEAN Charter, which refers to cooperation norms that have been laid down in the so-called Treaty of Amity and Cooperation of 1976, in which in particular sovereignty norms are highlighted, in which ASEAN has been defined as an intergovernmental regional organizations with no ambitions towards a supranational decision-making process like we know it from the European Union. So national sovereignty, mutual respect for independence, sovereign equality, territorial integrity, national identity, non-interference into the internal affairs of the other members. That's basically what characterizes the ASEAN Way. It's a very shallow institutionalization. It's based on voluntarism, non-binding decisions, and for a long time, until to the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, there was a deliberate dissociation in ASEAN from the European model of integration. ASEAN spokespersons always maintained that ASEAN is a regional organization sui generis, what Europeans always also say, but in a very different way and very much differentiated from the European perspective. There's also an orthodoxy as regards what are the parameters of Indonesian foreign policy. In a nutshell, very much simplified, it is very much based on assumptions of political realism. Realpolitik is one of the main terms associated with that view. It's strongly nationalist. If you read sources, you always find the term national interest. That's always particularly strongly emphasized as a guide for Indonesian decision makers in their foreign policy making. Sovereignty, of course, is closely associated as well. And a sister of political realism, of course, is geopolitics. A strong geopolitical outlook is also involved in this foreign policy orthodoxy, which is influenced by Indianized ideas of foreign policy making, and a world with the mandala concept, which is still which you can still observe in the armed forces doctrine of international politics that can be described as the concentric circles doctrine that is there in Indonesia up to the present day, and this is influenced by age-honored concept like the Arthashastra that has been imported from India, and which is also well known in most of the Indianized, culturally Indianized states in Southeast Asia. But of course, as a state subjected to colonialism, it also highlights independence and active foreign policy making, and at the same time a very deep sentiment of victimization, of vulnerability, of distrust, which of course is closely associated with Indonesia's more recent but also longer history and the years, the centuries of colonialization. So you can very frequently observe this, what I call survivalist rhetoric, which is part and parcel of this idea. It is, of course, hence sensitive to power shifts. You very frequently encounter terms like hedging or balancing, and a very succinct pragmatism that is involved in foreign policy making. But contrary to what I said, also strong leadership aspirations. Indonesia is conscious of the fact that it is by far the largest country in Southeast Asia, and therefore also seeks to be a leader that bestows prestige, recognition, dignity on Indonesia. And it's also a very ethnocentric perspective. That's what you can see, what this map shows, because here you can very well see that Indonesia is at the center of the world, and that's also something what is very crucial in how Indonesian foreign policy makers approach the world. Now, the external challenge came with the Asian financial crisis. You might be familiar with theories of ideational change. One of the major preconditions for ideational change are so-called crises or external shocks, of which the Asian financial crisis, of course, was one. And as a result of that shock, also the ASEAN Way, the ASEAN Way came under siege. A lot of external, but increasingly also internal commenters were no longer persuaded that the ASEAN Way is the right institutional setup for ASEAN to proceed as a regional organization, and has, as a consequence, triggered a debate on how Southeast Asian regionalism should and could be reformed. And here the gaze, the view were very much oriented towards the European Union as the front runner model of regional organizations, and the import of organizational elements of the European integration model. You could see that from the Bali Concord II onward, that was passed or was agreed in 2003, which incorporated seemingly liberal cosmopolitan ideas that have never been a part of ASEAN before, like stressing democracy and human rights, like other European concepts, building the organization on three pillars. The term community was anathema for much of the past of ASEAN. Regional integration was a concept that has not been frequently used before. There was a committee of permanent representatives set up, which is also some terminology imported from the European Union. The strengthening of the regional parliamentary body, IPA, fell into that period, and also the idea to create a common market is very similar to European ideas of regional integration. Apart from that, debates also highlighted or demanded that the ASEAN Secretariat should be transformed into an ASEAN Commission. There should be an ASEAN Court of Justice. There should be a majority voting system, and there should even be a sanctioning of members who do not observe the agreed ASEAN norms and rules. And that raised this question, is ASEAN moving towards a regionalism concept which is strongly informed by the EU? That was the basic question, and now some of the empirical findings that came about. First of all, the three concepts or these three functions related to global governance that I mentioned before indeed were major guides for the comment of Indonesian stakeholders on how regionalism should develop or should change. The first frame, referring to political order functions, was very much focusing on democracy, making ASEAN as a regional organization more democratic than hitherto, was a response to global normative shifts which had been ignored until to that time, which I call a democracy frame, which was very strongly visible. A second frame that strongly referred to the welfare functions that many commentators associate with a reformed ASEAN making Southeast Asia more prosperous, was the demand articulated by them. And a third frame that referred to the security function, and which sensitively responded to the rise of China and India as a new ASEAN, as new Asian great powers, and responding and making ASEAN ready to compete in this more competitive environment. Now, the finding was also that the democracy frame was strongly employed by virtually all stakeholder groups except the business sector. The business sector did not comment or did not mention anything that in the direction that ASEAN should become a more democratic organization. The welfare frame was, as could be expected, very strongly mentioned by NGOs, but also by business organizations and by legislators. while the security frame was basically found among think tank academics, government officials, and partly also legislators. Now, the second point, the grafting, the old and the new, the fusion of the old and new values. That's also very interesting because what in particular has been grafted with extant values was the democracy frame. Democracy and human rights were something new in the ASEAN cooperation norms, and that in order to make it palatable to a broad section of the Indonesian public, it was grafted with extant values, with extant norms like leadership and also like soft power. Soft power is not a new invention of American scholars Joseph Nye or Robert Keohane. It can also be, as Parodi Ngutragun has shown, very much shown in pre-colonial Indonesia, that highlighting prestige and leadership is something which is very important for the legitimization of the rulers, and here in the Indonesian case, leadership was based on the fact that Indonesia became the third largest democracy in the world. That's a formula you find very often in the Commons, and that particularly entitles Indonesia to leadership. So this is a major change. Before, Indonesian leadership ambitions were basically based on physical criteria like large size, like large population. Now it's normative criteria, so the third largest democracy, and this also gives a lot of prestige to Indonesia. Indonesia was commended for that, placing it on a moral high ground, and also establishing some sort of an Indonesian exceptionalism, which you find very frequently among great powers as a major trait of their mission. Soft power, as I said, is also a very old ingredient in Indonesian foreign policy thinking, and so democracy and human rights was fused with these two values. Leadership also comes up in another sense. Leadership is a culturally highly rated concept in the region, and to lead also means independence and activity, two basic concepts that underline Indonesian doctrines of foreign policy making since independence. It's a core doctrine of Indonesian foreign policy making, and that's also part of this fusion process. Now, a third fusion is democracy that is linked with what could be called organic state theory. In Indonesia, it's also known as integrationalism, which is a very, how should I say that, not really only conservative, perhaps even reactionary European way of thinking about the states that became quite prominent, especially in continental Europe in the 19th century, which was also adapted by Indonesian nationalists for other reasons. And that was also a part of the democracy concept that was frequently discussed, especially by representatives of the Indonesian state. It was linked to collectivist traditions like Musyawarah and Mufakat, and references to Pancasila, to references to Eastern conceptualizations of democracy, the concept of an Asian democracy. All this hinted that the democracy concept is to be linked with illiberal notions of democracy that were used in order to make democracy, the term democracy, palatable to Indonesia, with a conservative normative outlook. And you could also see that in the language that is used, that is replete with corporatist rhetorical figures and metaphors like familism, brotherhood, fraternity, harmony, unity, consensus. That's all part of this old concept of Indonesian integrationalism, which is merged with the advancement of liberal democracy concepts. You could also see it, that in the debate, especially by government officials, the word empowerment is virtually excluded in the discourse. We would probably, as Westerners, closely link empowerment with democracy, or what in a previous contribution was called participation in decision making. People-orientedness, that's the term that is used in the Indonesian debate, is rather meant as participation in implementation. So non-state stakeholders, yes, they can participate in foreign policy making, in issues of regionalism, but only as so-called transmission belts for government policies. They participate in what the government propagates. That's basically the idea behind this people-orientedness concept. And even if you look beyond that, the Indonesian government was very proud in arguing that it has opened the black box of foreign policy maker to all kinds of stakeholders, non-state stakeholders, especially the so-called institution of the foreign policy breakfast was highlighted in that connections, where the government once a month invited all kinds of non-state stakeholders to discuss foreign policy issues. But if you look at who was invited, who participated in this process, you could easily see that it's only groups and representatives who were close to the policy agenda of the Indonesian government. Critics were not frequently invited, and the process was very much top-down, that the Indonesian government informed what is going on in foreign policy issues, in regional issues, in charter negotiation, but there was very little opportunity for non-state actors to question that or to bring in their own perspective. And what the government mostly or mainly expected was that these non-state actors socialize what the government thinks about the ASEAN Charter or about Indonesian roles in regionalism and foreign policy making. Then one interesting thing was also that democracy was also grafted, fused with non-interference. And this seems to be a contradiction in terms. Nevertheless, it is interesting how this was made compatible. It was made compatible because Indonesian commentators thought that Indonesia, as the only democratic country in Southeast Asia, would be the one which interferes. It would not become the object of interferences and would be immune to intervention, so to speak. Yet, in practice, it became very quickly clear that this was not what the Indonesian government in effect practiced in Papua or Aceh. Of course, the Indonesian government strongly rejected if there were attempts from Australia or from Western countries to criticize the Indonesian government on that. The welfare frame was rather unproblematic in the sense that welfare was always a very strong legitimization ground for rulers in the Indonesian archipelago. And here what had to be fused was liberal development, a liberal strategy that was grafted then with this old prosperity topos, and could easily be linked with previous Indonesian ideational traditions where welfare and small people well-being was highlighted, like Sukarno's Mahanism or the people's economy in the late 90s, the cooperative movement, or even socialist and communist thoughts that also have been important elements in the Indonesian political discourse. The security frame is also relatively unsurprising, as I have shown before, that security always played a major role in Indonesian thinking. This was also linked often with leadership and old visions of security, and here the key argument was that regional cooperation should be deepened in order to increase regional cohesion, and that would also enable Indonesia to exert to a better extent its leadership or self-styled leadership functions in ASEAN and vis-à-vis the region, would strengthen also the ASEAN position, the bargaining power in international organizations, and Indonesia as leader would benefit from that by an increase in image, status, and prestige. Now, the pruning of the regionalism concept is something what, of course, would be expected is that ASEAN visions or Indonesian visions on ASEAN removed all supranational dimensions from regionalism. I mean, this element of European regionalism was removed from the Indonesian ideas on regionalism, and also idealist underpinnings of European ideas on integration as a self-propelled self-propelling process were largely cut from Indonesian ideas of regionalism. Interesting and surprising, on the other hand, was that the sovereignty dimension of the ASEAN Way, at least temporarily, was relaxed, and also a liberal economic agenda of EU type of integration was pruned, especially among NGOs and partly business, the business sector and the academe. Now, coming to what has changed since the years 2005 to 2009, what I did in this part of the book was I left the deductive perspective and did an inductive run through the resource, through the source material I had, and here it could be shown that indeed I overlooked a major frame of discussing ASEAN, especially in the latter part of this debate, which could be called a leadership frame. And this leadership frame expresses that from a certain point onward, when exactly is difficult to say, it's a gradual process, leadership became much more important, became a value in its own right, and it was not based on the democratization of the Indonesian policy anymore. Leadership became a value in its own right. This is the message. This could be seen, I would say, from 2009 onward. There, the leadership issue became increasingly strong in comments on Indonesian, on Southeast Asian regionalism, and this, of course, also raised the question to what extent what has been localized has been reversed again. And that's what I then studied in this part of the book. I more or less tried to make a test in how far, to what extent these new ideas that obviously had been appropriated from the European Union have been socialized by Indonesian policy makers. And this was very interesting because I looked into two issues in which the sovereignty was jeopardized, territorial issues and economic issues. One was the so-called Ambalat crisis with Malaysia, where Malaysia and Indonesia fought over maritime regions in the Celebes or Sulawesi Sea, and the economic issue was the ASEAN-China free trade area and the Indonesian role in it. And it was very interesting because I could show that in both debates on these issues, Indonesian decision makers, which had highlighted the lofty norms of European integration before, a few years before, now switched back to a very archaic sovereignty-based discourse in which even well-reputed Indonesian journal dailies like Kompas published figures about the armed arsenal of Malaysia and Indonesia, and what would happen if a war breaks out between the two countries, and also the issue of the flooding of the Indonesian market by cheap Chinese product as a result of the ASEAN China free trade area caused very shrill rhetoric in which there was a complete reversal towards what could be called economic nationalism. That's basically what you see here on these two, on this transparency. Now, the last point, what has changed under the Jokowi administration, when Jokowi came to power, most commentators argued that under Jokowi there would be a complete change of the Indonesian foreign policy, not one of the outward-looking type of the Yudhoyono era, but rather a foreign policy in which the national interest comes first. I think if you translate the American slogan into Indonesian, the topic would be Indonesia first. That's what people expected would happen under Jokowi, but my position is that this is not correct evaluation of the more recent developments in Indonesian thinking about regionalism and foreign policy making. I figured out 6 major issues that were crucial in this period between 2014 and the present. That is, what role should ASEAN play in the Indonesian foreign policy? Should it still be the cornerstone, or should it be only a cornerstone, as some people say should be the case under the Jokowi foreign policy perspective? Then many people also predicted that there would be a complete abandonment of the relatively optimistic SBY slogan, no enemies, a million friends, a doctrine on which Jokowi, on which Yudhoyono was very proud. Securing borders and natural resources was also a point since the Jokowi administration started sinking foreign fishing boats that intruded maritime space of Indonesia. Then the shift, policy shift towards what Jokowi called a global maritime axis, in which Indonesia should be integrated, a creeping remilitarization of ASEAN policies and foreign policy, and a more protectionist trade policy, especially vis-à-vis the ASEAN Economic Community that was launched in late 2015. To make it short, all these 6 policy issues showed no major difference between Jokowi and Yudhoyono. Already in the Yudhoyono era, these things began to change in the direction that the Jokowi government adopted these policies. The only major difference was that in the Jokowi administration, you could see that in a lot of international speeches in the UN and in ASEAN and elsewhere, the Jokowi administration, democracy was no longer emphasized as a key foreign policy objective. Now, what are the conclusions? The conclusions are that, of course, Indonesian foreign policy making became more inclusive, in the sense that at least there was a certain consultative role of non-state stakeholders that were not part of Indonesian foreign policy making in the era before, under Suharto. But it also became clear that this is not a really vibrant process. Not all stakeholders participate all the time, and also the stakeholder participation declined considerably over the last years. The legislature, for instance, is much more inward-looking nowadays than it was under the ASEAN reform debate. Stakeholders, that would be the third major conclusions, localize the European concept of regionalism very selectively, very differently. There's no uniform appropriation of European ideas, and also this has to do with the fact that the Indonesian thinking on regionalism is still very much oriented towards what has been called the cognitive prior, both of ASEAN and Indonesian foreign policy, and still a very strong reconfirmation of the extant norms and values. There is a strong nationalist dimension in which Indonesian foreign policy nationalism is reinvented and modernized. There is no decisive departure from ASEAN as the cornerstone of Indonesian foreign policy. There is still a lot of difference to the European concept of regionalism. At least one could not claim that there is a convergence of ideas ASEAN or Indonesians had on regionalism. And I do not go into details here. I also think was able to nuance the norm diffusion theory in a number of ways, and could also show, as demanded or as argued by Amitav Achaya in his seminal contributions on norm diffusions, that players, that actors in the non-Western regions are not only passive recipients of ideas that radiate from the West to the non-West regions, but that they are very active in reproducing and reimagining concepts in this case of regionalism. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thanks very much, Jürgen. It's interesting in terms of the character of your talk, the ambitions on the one hand to make this important theoretical contribution, but also in terms of your study of Indonesia, looking both at these stakeholders and also the chronological change between leaders, particularly the last two Indonesian presidents. We can open up the floor now that the room is getting cooler. Perhaps people may get too cool, actually. I've gone to the other extreme. I'm noticing the Arctic temperatures may be setting in. Hong Kong is very extreme. Either it's too hot or it's too cold. While people are gathering their thoughts, let me ask this, Jürgen. So in terms of what is driving this, if I understood correctly what you're arguing, so you have the Asian financial crisis, but you also have, of course, the immediate change in Indonesia itself, the Reformasi and the democratic transition. You have the third wave, as it's called in democratization studies, reaching its peak, as it were. So it's not just Indonesia, which is the most significant case of democratic transition in Southeast Asia, overshadowing the Thai case in the early 90s and the Philippines in the mid 80s. But also, this global trend toward democracy at the time, seemingly. And then, 20 years later, we see, one Southeast Asian democracy after another having fallen, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia's coming under pressure with growing intolerance as exhibited by the blasphemy trial against Ahok and former governor of Indonesia, of Jakarta. So, I mean, can that be seen as one of the drivers of what's going on here, that, Indonesia saw itself as, riding the wave of the global wave of democratization, itself being the prime example, and then as this wave declines, including in Indonesia itself, the norms begin to return somewhat closer to this pre-97 stage, or I mean, or are there other major drivers of the kind of norm, sort of, it's almost like
cyclical, it seems. I mean, you seem to have some change initially, but now it's very much going back to some of these older norms, pre-1997, 98. But I just throw that out as a general question of what you see as behind these changes.
Yeah, I think foreign policy, of course, cannot be dissociated from what is going on in other sectors in the respective country. And in that respect, of course, as you rightly observed, democracy is coming under siege increasingly by various groups in Indonesia, and that also has repercussions on the way the foreign policy is valued and is seen. One of the perhaps most interesting aspects is what I briefly mentioned here, is sort of a remilitarization of foreign policy making, in especially regard to ASEAN policies. For quite some time, until the demise of the Suharto regime, the military was, at least publicly, quite silent as an actor in foreign policy making. But now you could really see that in a number of issues the military again came up public with recommendations of the Indonesian for the Indonesian government what to do. In the case of the South China Sea, the Natuna Islands, for instance, is a case, or also the increasing fear that the ASEAN economic community, or in other words globalization, could have serious repercussions for Indonesia, in the sense that it attracts in-migration into Indonesia. All this has given rise to responses of the military you haven't seen before. So I think the overall climate basically has to do with it. But on the other hand, I would also say these reversals also are a clear indication of that what was celebrated in terms of reforms in the years before was not really socialized. I mean, this was a thin layer put over these integrationist ideas of state action that had existed in Indonesia for a very long time, since the independence movement, and this has been a driver of that process as well, and especially if foreign developments seem to vindicate these kind of ideas, they celebrate a comeback and become more prevalent than they had been in the past.
Thank you. Other questions?
Two quick questions to my end. Obviously, you've talked about the free frames,
Yeah.
That you mentioned.
Yeah.
And you obviously talked about the mechanism, i.e. there is a certain European model, and then based on the local conditions, the existing frame, they sort of get distilled a little bit and changed a little bit and localized a little bit. I wonder about the distillation or the localization from the elite level down to the popular level, especially in accordance with the free frames. For example, you mentioned about how Jokowi is talking less about the democratization frame. Is it something that, after being pushed in the previous presidencies, the civil society sort of clings on to it? I.e., even if the elite start talking less about it, there would still be some followers. on the social level? That's the first question. The second question is more to pertain back to the foreign policy question. Obviously, on one hand, you talked about Jokowi talking less about democratization, sort of democratic aspects. But then at the same time, he's definitely not pursuing a kind of Indonesian first policy approach. Do we see Indonesia walking towards a more values-based form of foreign policy, as you would see in Japan, or to a lesser extent in India? Which, of course, the natural leading question is because that will naturally define Indonesia's response towards China.
Should I?
Yeah.
I start with the second question. I'm not familiar with Japan, but I would doubt whether India is moving towards a more value-based foreign policy. Indians have never made a major argument out of the fact that they are the largest democracy in the world, at least measured by the number of people living in India. India always, from a very short period excluded under Nero in the 1950s, has always pursued a very pragmatic realpolitik in every sense. You could see that, for instance, in its behavior vis-à-vis Myanmar. Few years, 2 years, 3 years, they supported the democracy movement after the uprising in 1988. But then it realized that China is really getting a foothold in Myanmar that is threatening Indian foreign policy doctrines, for instance, the control of the Indian Ocean. So I wouldn't say that, and I also wouldn't say that Indonesia has, in the long run, taking a turn towards a value-based foreign policy. For a short period, yes, under SBY, and especially Hassan Wirayuda, when he was the foreign minister, you could say that much more than in the past and in the previous, in the present time, value in the sense of liberal cosmopolitan beliefs played a role in Indonesian foreign policy, but no longer in the Jokowi era. I would not see that. It's also a very much realist, realpolitik oriented foreign policy. The first question, you are right. What I presented was basically an elite perspective. But foreign policy making, by all accounts, in Indonesia and probably a lot of other countries in the region is still a very elitist issue. You could see that I did a study on election campaigns and the extent to which they articulated foreign policy issues, even at the time when, with the ASEAN Economic Community, there was an issue that had far-reaching repercussions on the life of every Indonesian. Still, foreign policy was a highly marginal aspect. So I would also say, yes, NGOs still maintain the issue that foreign policy should be more democratic, but I would also say that many NGO representatives are not really part of the grassroots, even though they often argue they are, but they are also highly educated persons who have a strong elite nexus in many extent. So I would even go so far and say that foreign policy issues at the grassroots have very little impact on what people think policymakers should do.
Other questions?
Yeah, there's one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Lu. I enjoy your talk a lot because I'm also working on something similar for ASEANs. I've got two questions. The first one is like throughout the whole discussion, it seems that interpretations of regionalism per se, Indonesia was more or less domestically driven. What strikes me more interest is on how actually the current crisis in Rakhine and also on the more and more radicalization of the Indonesian society recently because of the incident, like presented by the incident faced by Ahok, like how the growing religious crisis in the region would actually play a role in the interpretations of regionalism or ASEAN regionalism in Indonesia or among the elites. How would they interpret it given the growing tension and polarization within the regions on how to treat religion as an issue? And the second question is, throughout, I think most of the scholars would like to use ASEAN as a counter example of like EU or like the EU diffusion model, or maybe like try to see the interaction between ASEAN and EU. But I'm also curious about how actually ASEAN or the Indonesian elites try to interpret Asian regionalism, or how do they actually respond to Asian perception of regionalism, like Sokpan, the Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality, what's basically an outcome of the contestation between Malaysia and Indonesia, and how would actually Indonesia nowadays use Asian countries as in probably authority or maybe otherings in order to justify or legitimize its foreign policy directions. Like, would there be any examples on how, like for example, how they try to othering China as a bad example, or maybe like as a others, in order to legitimize?
Could you repeat that, because I did not fully get what is the thrust of the question?
The first one is how.
No, the first I got the second one.
Yeah, it's how actually Indonesia respond to Asians' interpretations of regionalism or Asian style regionalism. Would they see any differences from their own perceptions of how regionalism should be perceived from other countries, and how would they try to justify their or legitimize their interpretations?
Yeah, I think both questions are very interesting and very important. The religion question is one where two norms collide. With religion, of course, there's the human rights question if you refer to the Rohingya minority in Myanmar, for instance, but that collides with a non-interference norm. And Indonesia is an interesting case because it tried to reconcile both norms and apply the human rights norms when it can be sure that it has no repercussion on its own problems. As I mentioned earlier, when it comes to Papua or when it comes to internal issues, Indonesia always is adamant that there will be no intervention from outside. So this is a quite interesting observation. The second point, in what way can Indonesia make its ideas of regionalism felt in the region? I would say only partly. In the whole debate on the ASEAN Charter, Indonesia was not able to impress its viewpoints on its peers. For instance, the best example is the ASEAN Human Rights Commission, AICHA, which has strongly propagated by Indonesia, and in a much more in a sense that it has much more teeth than it has currently. And in effect, what came out was a quite tame and quite teethless body, and it could be very well shown that this was a case of Indonesia against all others. Indonesia was left alone. Also, other countries like Indonesia and at that time Thailand sympathized with the Indonesian position, but Indonesia had great pains in even finding acceptance for the Human Rights Commission as it is right now. And that occurs in a number of other issues as well, where Indonesia has not really been able to make its position palatable and amenable to the other ASEAN countries.
Yes, well, I think all that remains now that we've come to 5:30 is for us to collectively thank you for a great talk.